Agenda for today, we're going to start off with introductions. Then we'll do an overview of the rate case parties and timeline. We'll talk about what Rhode Island Energy has proposed in the rate case. Then we'll get into why this rate case matters for affordability and climate. We'll talk about what we're advocating for and hope to see come out of the rate case, how you can get involved, and then again, we'll be sure to leave time at the end for Q&A. Today's speakers include myself. I'm Amanda Barker. I'm the Clean Energy Program Manager at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. And I'm joined by my colleague, Tina Munter, who is our Rhode Island policy advocate. And then we have a close ally joining us today, Jamie Rhodes, who is a senior attorney at the Conservation Law Foundation. To quickly introduce Green Energy Consumers Alliance, we are a nonprofit organization based in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and our mission is to empower consumers and communities to speed a just transition to a zero carbon world. And we do that through both programs. We have a lot of consumer-facing educational content, basically around any way that you can decarbonize. And then we also do a lot of policy advocacy, including in this rate case. And I'll pass it off to Jamie to introduce the Conservation Law Foundation.
Thanks, Amanda. Yes, my name is, once again, Jamie Rhodes. I'm a senior attorney at the Conservation Law Foundation. We're a member-supported organization based here in New England that works for a thriving New England for all. This takes us form of our work on clean energy and climate. We do clean air and water work, environmental justice advocacy and transportation advocacy, as well as strategic litigation around climate and climate-related issues. So we try to serve as one more set of attorneys for the environment, and that takes its form in both our utility cases that we do here, litigation at state and federal courts, and also a fair amount of work at the legislature. And we have offices in all 6 New England states.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. All right. So now to get into an overview of the rate case. So Rhode Island Energy has filed a major electric and gas distribution rate case that is currently before the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission in docket number 2545GE. And they filed this case in late 2025, and this is actually the first rate case in Rhode Island since 2017. So it's been quite a while, and there are several parties involved. Jamie will get into what the utility is requesting in a bit, but first I just want to do an overview of the key parties in the proceeding. So Rhode Island Energy is obviously a party seeking approval for increased rates and infrastructure investments. The Division of Public Utilities and Carriers is representing the public interest and ratepayers. The Public Utilities Commission is the decision-making body that will ultimately approve, deny, or modify the proposal. The Rhode Island Attorney General's Office also participates to protect consumers and ratepayers. And then there are a few large commercial participants that are large energy users, such as Amtrak and Walmart. And then the Conservation Law Foundation has intervened to advocate for alignment with our climate policies, as well as energy affordability. And CLF is sponsoring 4 expert witnesses. The first of which is Juan Pablo Velez of Switchbox, who is providing testimony on heat pump rates. Then Liz Stanton of Applied Economics Clinics is going to be providing testimony on the benefit cost analysis of heat pump rates. Michael Walsh of Groundwork Data is providing testimony on gas line extension allowances. And then Green Energy Consumers Alliance's Executive Director, Larry Cretion, is going to be providing testimony related to compliance with Rhode Island's Act on Climate Law. To go over timeline for the rate case, again, the rate case was filed in late November of last year, and January 20th was the deadline for parties to intervene. And interveners gain the ability to submit testimony, issue discovery questions, cross-examine witnesses, and participate in the hearings and settlement discussions. Intervener testimony was due on April 16th. So the Conservation Law Foundation and all the other parties that I mentioned including the Conservation Law Foundation's expert witnesses. We all submitted testimony by April 16th, all of which is available on the docket page if you're interested in taking a deep dive. May 13th, Rhode Island Energy submitted rebuttal testimony responding to the intervener's initial testimony. And our rebuttal testimony back to Rhode Island Energy is due May 26th. So we're currently working on responding to what Rhode Island Energy said and sort of refining our arguments before the hearings begin. The evidentiary hearings will take place between June 1st and July 15th. And these are formal hearings before the Public Utilities Commission, where witnesses testify under oath and parties can conduct cross-examination. And this is where much of the factual record is developed. June 10th, there's going to be a public comment hearing. So this provides an opportunity for community members to provide input on the proposed rate increases and utility investments. There'll be more on this opportunity later from Tina. And then after the hearings conclude, parties will submit legal briefs summarizing their arguments, and the commission will then deliberate and issue a decision at an open meeting. Rhode Island Energy may subsequently submit compliance filings reflecting required modifications. And so all of that, the dates are to be determined, but they will happen before September 1st when the suspension period ends. Now I'm going to hand it off to Jamie to talk about what Rhode Island Energy has proposed.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, my goal here is just to hit some of the high notes, at least as far as what Rhode Island Energy put on the record and what they are requesting the Public Utilities Commission to do. I will note that there is a lot of testimony behind this. There's lots more detail than just the notes that I presented here. There's 21 books of information that they filed, so it's been a lot of reading. But I think these are the primary notes that you'll see in both the media coverage of it as well as the top line issues that need to be resolved in this case. So the first one is just what are the numbers? What are the dollars and cents here? Rhode Island Energy is proposing increases in their base distribution rates. This is the base rate that we pay for the distribution of energy to our homes. Both on the gas and electric system, with much larger increases in the first year and then smaller increases in the second year. In the first year, they're requesting $114.7 million in new funds to run the gas system. This equates to about $344 per customer per year. It's obviously going to be based on actual usage. How much gas you use will determine how much you actually pay, but that's for their average customer. And then in the second year, there'd be an additional $31.8 million or $89 per year of rate increases for this one, again, just for the cost of the gas distribution system. On the electric side, the proposal is for $65.9 million in the first year, an additional $17.6 million in the second year. And that roughly comes out to $7.80 per month in the first year, an additional $1.50 per month in the second year. You'll note that they measured this in years versus months on the gas versus electric side. I don't have an exact reason why they do that, but my personal opinion is that your gas usage is so different, like it's so much different in the winter than it is in the summer, that it never equates out to an actual per month change. It's more of what are you going to pay in additional in the heating season, which is mostly in the winter. While the gas is your usage is much more normalized, and that you do use electricity every month of the year, whether it's hot or cold. And so it's easier to map that out on a by month basis. So the second point is and this is one that gets a lot of coverage, is the company's return on equity. This is how much of a profit do they have the opportunity of making. They're not guaranteed to make this money, but this is the profit margin that they are allowed to earn on the operations of the system. They're proposing a return on equity of 10.75%. So this would be 10.75% of the poles and wires and infrastructure that is purchased or that is built using the equity funds that they have. If they're buying things with debt by loans or grants, not grants, those aren't debt, but if they're buying things by loans or other sort of debt service, there's no return on equity that's charged to it. Instead, we're paying the interest that goes to the lender for it. The current return on equity is 9.25%, so a 1.5% increase is their proposal. And we're not going into all the other pieces of the docket, but let's just say there's a lot of information from the division and the Attorney General contesting why this should not be at 10.75%. But we'll let their testimony speak for their positions on it. Um, they're also they are also requesting funding for development of future time of use rates. The idea here is both a piece of software that is specific to doing time of use rate analysis, as well as a consultant that does time of use rate development, rate design. And so they're seeking upfront costs to bring those on board so that in a future rate case, they can propose time of use rates. I think the core here is that we've got to finish the advanced meter rollout, which is something we'll touch on later in the presentation. They're also proposing a change to low income discount rate. This is how much of a discount low income folks are able to receive based off of eligibility for existing programs. Whether that's LIHEAP or SNAP or assistance in some form, you get a discount rate, and they're proposing some alterations to that would, for the most part, be more generous and include steeper discounts for those that have the least resources. One thing of note that in our opinion that there's not really any proposals from the company, from Rhode Island Energy, about how they are going to implement the climate action strategy that was published this last year, which is supposed to be our pathway towards implementing the Act on Climate. We haven't seen anything in the case from their perspective that is responsive to that, which is why we intervened and we have proposed some items for that. So that's in a nutshell what Rhode Island Energy proposed. There are a lot more details there, and if folks have questions about any specific items, I'm sure we're more than happy to field them, even if it's not in real time. I have to actually go back and read the documents themselves. So with that, I believe I'm handing it back to Amanda.
Actually, me.
Oh, Tatita, I should have written that down.
Thank you, Jamie. Good tee up at the end, though, talking about proposals for the Rhode Island Climate Action Strategy, because we feel, along with CLF and other interveners, that this rate case is actually critically important because elements of it can help the state meet the greenhouse gas reduction mandates under the Act on Climate. So for a little bit of context, the right in that image shows the state's progress towards meeting that law. And if you're not familiar, the Act on Climate requires emissions reductions that culminate in reaching net zero by 2050, with interim targets in 2030 and 2040. So in the graph, the stars show those interim years, and then that blue line, kind of jagged, kind of declining, show the state's progress on emissions reductions thus far. However, I want to note that this inventory, while it is the state's most recent and official greenhouse gas inventory, it is from 2023 data. So the Department of Environmental Management produces these reports, but they are on a bit of a delay. So while we are hoping to see data about 2024 come out around the end of this calendar year, this DEM greenhouse gas inventory is what a lot of the state's other climate plans are built off of. So I think that's kind of important to take into account, is that the data that we have available is already a couple of years old, and the state, isn't at a standstill in between while we are waiting for these reports to be built. So the main takeaway is that Rhode Island is just, about 3.5 very short years away from meeting that 2030 Act on Climate mandate. However, we need to make much more progress on reducing emissions statewide if we are to hit that goal. And from our vantage point at Green Energy Consumers, we aren't even fully sure that the state is on track to meet 2030 under currently adopted policies. However, that doesn't mean that the state needs to, has to, or should give up. There are many other things and avenues to pursue to create emissions reductions, and that is where the rate case comes in. So aspects of our testimony that we will talk about later in this webinar discuss a change to an existing Rhode Island energy policy and a new rate design, which both of these things can help reduce gas system expansion and encourage electrification. And we feel that particularly discussing these policy changes are appropriate in this rate case right now, because it's the most immediate venue we have to advocate for and for the company to introduce measures that will help reduce gas consumption in the state. And while I want to note that the Public Utilities Commission, or PUC, did open a docket entitled "The Future of the Regulated Gas Distribution Business in Light of the Act on Climate," progress can still be made on developing policies that support the Act on Climate outside of that docket and its scope. And that docket, for short, the Future of Gas docket, was opened 4 years ago in April of 2022. And while a technical report was released in April of 2024 by their consultant, the Commission has not yet released their official policy report and have not issued guidance on when stakeholders can actually anticipate it to come out. So for right now, at least, meetings and progress in that docket have kind of been on a pause, for lack of a better word, right now. So therefore, at this point, we feel that the rate case is the most appropriate and immediate venue to develop policies that can encourage emissions reductions and reduce fossil fuel consumption in the state, because under the Act on Climate, in the law, addressing the impacts of climate change and actually implementing that law is under the purview of all state bodies, which does include the Public Utilities Commission. So therefore, in dockets where it's appropriate, such as this one, the PUC should be requiring Rhode Island Energy to develop programs that support emissions reductions. And also, kind of to layer onto that, if the company is truly committed to supporting the Act on Climate and being an active, engaged participant in fostering emissions reductions, we feel that they too should be willing to pursue policy changes, rate designs, the host of measures that can reduce emissions and make electrification in Rhode Island both more accessible for Rhode Islanders and also more affordable, because you can do both. We can have a future that goes towards a just transition to electrification, but also make sure that all ratepayers come along, folks aren't being left behind in this transition, and that rates can be contained or people aren't facing spiraling, rising gas costs in the future years. So Amanda, if you could go to the next slide, we'll start talking about some of the policies that we are advocating for. So the first policy that I'll be talking about is ending subsidies for new gas connections. So to give a primer on what this policy is, under the current Gas 101 tariff, Rhode Island Energy grants free or low-cost line extension allowances, or LEAs, to customers seeking them if, using the company's economic test, the cost to build the allowance is less than the expected revenue that the company will generate by adding on that new customer. However, if the line extension allowance is calculated to be more expensive than projected revenue or expected revenue, the customer will be required to pay a contribution in aid of construction or kayak payment to cover the difference. But this line extension allowance policy can encourage growth of the gas system by using these kind of future revenue projections from that prospective new customer to reduce or eliminate the upfront construction cost to the customer under the assumption that it will be paid back over time as the customer is connected to the system and as they use gas. However, we feel that this policy is no longer appropriate for the gas system and for this state overall. We feel that the economic test has some pretty fundamental flaws in it, most notably that the company does not compare projected gas consumption levels used for the economic test to actual consumption of gas after the line extension allowance is constructed, and that can overstate the projected revenue from that new connection. The company also utilizes a gas service lifetime, I believe it's around 50 years, that exceeds obviously the last date in the Act on Climate by which the state must reach net zero emissions. So while in theory, if a new customer uses gas at the projected level and they remain on the gas system for the projected lifetime, both factors used in the economic test among other ones, but I'm just pulling out these two, the line extension allowance should offset the costs imposed to other users on the gas system. However, because we have the Act on Climate that culminates in net zero emissions by 2050, because the company doesn't compare projected consumption to actual consumption, those two factors mean that the value of connecting a new customer to the system is likely overstated, and therefore the company doesn't or will not recoup the revenue that they've actually projected. So that is what can lead to that subsidy for new gas system users that's paid for by all other customers, that loss in revenue. So aside from the inherent equity issue that exists within the allowance policy, continuing to add line extensions for new gas service is also just inconsistent with the Act on Climate. fossil fuel burning appliances are less efficient than their electric counterparts, like air source heat pumps. And that also leads customers to use more energy and pay more for energy than for that same service if they just had a more efficient appliance. And with the Act on Climate, with mandating emissions reductions over time, we know that the state must start moving away from the gas system, must start, pursuing neighborhood scale electrification and a managed transition away from the gas system. So remaining dependent on our gas infrastructure will also just lock Rhode Islanders into this fuel source for many years in the future. And it's also a fuel source that will get more expensive. So not only do ratepayers have to pay to maintain the infrastructure over its lifetime, but if there are customers that transition towards electrification, the costs for maintaining the gas system remain the same. However, it's paid for by fewer and fewer customers, so the individual cost burden can increase, also exacerbating that equity issue. And I also want to make the point that continuing to expand both the gas system, but also the electric system that we need for our cleaner, more efficient future means that Rhode Islanders are paying to maintain and to build two separate infrastructure systems. So that gas pipeline network is competing with cleaner electricity and continuing to sink money into expanding that system and tie in new people or lock in new people or new customers will continue to lead Rhode Islanders down this expensive and polluting path of gas usage. The other point, just in the general landscape of gas costs and the downsides to connecting to the gas system, is that Rhode Island must import the fossil fuels like that methane gas that we use in the state. And geopolitical events, such as what we're seeing right now with the war in Iran, are events that drive up prices in New England and in Rhode Island. And that also exacerbates this intense energy affordability squeeze that I'm sure many folks are cognizant of or feeling at this moment. Not to mention, there's a myriad of public health reasons for why switching to electric equipment is better for air quality, quality of life for residents. I want to note that there are many states that have eliminated or are taking steps to revise their line extension allowance policies. So this is not something that Rhode Island would be uniquely pursuing separate from other states. There's much precedent from states like California, New York, Colorado, Washington, even Massachusetts are working on revising these policies. And so alongside our advocacy for eliminating the line extension allowance policy in the rate case, we've worked with CLF and also legislators to introduce a resolution requesting that the PUC terminate this line extension allowance policy as part of the rate case. So, pursuing the resolution at the General Assembly level, we hope just encourages an additional push on evaluating and eliminating this policy when it's actually discussed during the hearings. So at the end of the webinar, I will talk a little bit about how you can get involved with that legislation or with the rate case more broadly. But for now, I'll pass it back to Amanda to talk about the other policies that we're pursuing.
Awesome. Thanks, Tina. So another thing that we are advocating for in this rate case are heat pump rates, which are lower electric delivery rates for heat pump customers. Now, I want to be clear that this is not a discount or a handout for heat pump users. And that's because right now, under default electric rates, heat pump users are currently overpaying due to our volumetric rate structure. So volumetric rate structure means that customers pay based on how much electricity they use overall, rather than when or how much their usage affects the grid and the need to build out more poles and wires. Currently, New England's electric grid is summer peaking. This means that the grid is built out to handle peak demand during hot summer evenings when everyone is running their air conditioners. In the wintertime, however, there is extra capacity or headroom on the grid. So even though people use more electricity for heating with a heat pump, it doesn't add stress or any additional costs to maintain the grid. But because our rates charge for delivery based on total usage, heat pump users are being charged as if their winter electricity usage is causing additional costs on the system when they're not. And a fundamental principle of rate making is that ratepayers should only be charged for the cost that they incur upon the system. And right now, that's not the case with heat pumps. They are currently being overcharged. So that's why we're advocating for heat pump rates that would align delivery rates with the actual costs that heat pumps incur on the system. So how would our proposed heat pump rates move the needle on operating costs for heat pumps? The answer varies by the fuel type you're switching from, but overall, with a fair heat pump rate, the percentage of households that would save by switching to a heat pump would increase significantly. Natural gas homes would see the biggest saving increase, and that's because right now, under default electric rates, only around 21% of homes heated with natural gas would save if they were to switch to a heat pump. If we implemented a fair heat pump rate, 87% of homes with natural gas would save if they switched to a heat pump. For oil and propane, under default electric rates, currently 87% of households would save by switching to a heat pump, whereas with the fair heat pump rate, 99% of households would save. And with electric resistance, 100% of households would save with a fair heat pump rate. So in summary, this heat pump rate would be a real game changer that would enable more Rhode Island households to switch to affordable, clean heating. And with that, I will pass it off to Jamie to talk about the low-income discount rate.
Yeah, so the next step here is I'm going to take a couple of the other items that are being raised in the case and just give a sense of what is it that the company has proposed, what Rhode Island Energy has proposed, and then where are the points of disagreement, and what's going to be resolved as the case unfolds. So the for those that are familiar, the current low-income discount rate for electric customers, and I'll just note this is about the electric side of the electric side of the bill. Right now, there's two discounts. You can either get a 25% discount on your whole bill or 30% discount on your whole bill, depending on which other programs you're currently enrolled in. It's not based off of income level, it's based off of program participation. What they are proposing to do, what Rhode Island Energy is proposing to do, is to change it so that there's 3 tiers based off of income levels. Under 75% of the federal poverty line, then the household would receive a 60% discount. Between 76% and 150%, they would receive a 30% discount. And if you're between 151 and 250% of the federal poverty line, you'd receive a 10% discount. Now, they are also proposing to institute a minimum bill, which means that even if the discount brought you below a certain number, that everybody pays a minimum of $20 a month in costs. The theory behind this is that the electric distribution system serves everybody, and everybody should have a financial contribution to that system. The argument there is based primarily on fairness in that way. So what the other folks that are weighing in on this, and this is primarily through the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers and the Attorney General's office, are debating about whether, instead of this federal poverty line, whether we should be looking at an energy burden standard, which would be based off of somebody's circumstances. Is there a percentage of their income that should be the line upon which we're determining if energy is affordable? What is generally talked about is like 3% of our income going to electric costs, and if we're doing 3% going to electric, 3% to gas, and if you're all an electric customer, 6% of our energy burden. And that if you're paying more than that, then you're considered have burdened energy costs, and that you should be receiving a discount. And there's also a discussion about how many tiers should be created. The division proposed with a witness said that these discounts aren't necessarily looking at the differentiation between somebody at 76% of the federal poverty line and 150%, and that we should actually further divide this into 5 tiers, which more reflects the progressive nature of our income. And so that these buckets here are too large, too broad to be effective. I don't know where this is going to land. I'm looking forward to the testimony that's going to come up in the next few weeks to hear the different perspectives that are out there about why one methodology might be preferred over another. And I do expect that at the end of the case, there will be some revisions to the low-income discount rate, and all of these are in the direction of positive, in my point of view. And the only thing I would encourage is that we should do more to make sure that folks that are eligible for low-income discounts enroll. The current rates are about 22%, meaning 78% of Rhode Islanders that are eligible for discounts on their electric and gas bills are not receiving them. So anything we can do to boost that number and really tackle affordability through existing programs, things that are already available, is really incumbent upon all of us to make sure happens. So if you want to go to the next one here. the return on equity. So as I mentioned before, the company is proposed, Rhode Island Energy is proposing a return on equity of 10.75%, up from the current 9.25%. So the question behind return on equity comes down to a couple of core questions here. Is like, is Rhode Island Energy a riskier investment than other utilities? Which is an interesting question because utilities are guaranteed revenue. We have to pay them. They don't have to compete against other companies to exist. So in a lot of ways, the risk isn't whether they have customers or whether they're going to sell the product. The risk is really, are people not going to pay their bills? And there's a lot of testimony in here about what is the path, like what is the percentage of folks that aren't paying their bills and by how and for what reasons to determine if that level of risk is it inherent in what Rhode Island and being in Rhode Island is it inherent with our customers? Is it about the company and trying to understand what is the level of risk that should be set that we should understand Rhode Island Energy to have. And the same thing goes is who should Rhode Island Energy be compared to? The idea here is that if the company has to have a fair opportunity to earn money on its investments, but that is comparison to what other opportunities to invest there would be. So, are we comparing it to NVIDIA? Are we comparing it to a food store? Are we comparing it to the Dow Jones? That is the legitimate question of what should Rhode Island Energy be compared to in determining what that appropriate level of return should be. And then there's also the question of Rhode Island Energy is wholly owned by a parent company, PPL. How should it be viewed? What risk level should it be viewed at given that parent company? This is a new company. National Grid used to own our distribution system. It's now owned by PPL. So with the change in parent company, is there a change in the risk profile? Is there a change with who they should be compared to? Should they be compared as all of the utilities that PPL owns together, or should they be individual entities? These are the points that are going to be debated at the Public Utilities Commission, and eventually they will come up with a number. What the math will be, time will tell on how they get to it. I think we have one more, right? Yes, the time of use rates. So the map here is indicating how far Rhode Island Energy has completed its installation of advanced meters. So on the what is to me a purple lavender shade is where advanced meters have been installed, and where we have a more teal green shade is where they are going to be installed. And my understanding is that it should all be done by the end of 2026 to the third, fourth quarter of this year. And so what they proposed, as I mentioned before, is a consultant who is experiencing designing time of use rates, as well as specialized software that allows them to do the rate analysis necessary to design a time of use rates. And so the questions that have been proposed is, well, after the advanced meters are installed, how long do we have to wait before a time of use rates, the program can be designed? How long do we have to wait before it can be effectively implemented? Are they the same? Can we do a program design sooner and then do the implementation later? How much data is necessary from these meters to be effective or sufficient to be able to do that work? And I get the other question is, well, they haven't started doing the work yet. So should we pay Rhode Island Energy in advance for these costs? If we know this is going to be coming up, is it appropriate for us to pay in advance? Or should we wait until something has been created, and then we can determine whether it was a useful investment and whether it was the appropriate investment at the time? So there's always a question of whether utility costs should be paid up front, meaning things happen faster, or should we wait for them to be in place and then we reimburse the company for costs? And the other question becomes that if we know time of use rates are coming up, should the commission set any guardrails? Any requirements that a program should look like something in particular? Should it require a specific time sets of when when price differentiation will happen? A certain number of pricing periods during a time period. In the implementation, is there should be required education outreach effort or shadow billing where somebody can see what their bill would have been like under the old system versus the new system? Should these be requirements so that when Rhode Island Energy comes with the time of use rate proposal, it has these elements in there rather than having to debate in the future, should we have included something or should we not have? It's very often easier to answer that question up front before a program's proposed. All right.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. So if any of this interests you, and I hope it does, there are many different ways that you can get involved with the rate case. But actually, now that I think more about it, I do just want to say on Jamie's last points, if you are interested at all in time of use rates or advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, or smart meters, because they're coming to Rhode Island and many people already have them. Green Energy Consumers did a webinar on smart meters a couple of weeks ago now, but if you're interested to get a little bit more in the weeds on that, that's up on our YouTube page. You can watch it at any time. But back to taking action, there are several different ways. So one way is that everybody is more than welcome to come to a public comment hearing and give, their input, their statement on how you feel as a Rhode Islander, as a consumer, about these rate changes or any of the policies that we've discussed. I do want to note, we only pulled out a couple of them. There are many, many other interveners and other topics discussed that are all on the docket landing page. But if any of these topics in particular struck you, you can come to that public comment hearing, which is currently scheduled for June 10th, and it'll be up in Providence at the Department of Administration building. If you are unable or you don't want to come in person to the hearing, or you just have many comments that you'd like to make throughout the proceedings, you can also submit written comments to the email on the screen, Stephanie De La Rosa at the Public Utilities Commission, and they accept those comments throughout the proceeding as well if something comes up before, after the public hearing, or you just like to continuously submit things. Then I also want to note that if you are interested in the specific line extension allowance resolution or that topic that I had discussed earlier in the webinar, you are more than welcome to contact your legislators and submit testimony in support of it. So the formal resolution is entitled "A Resolution Requesting the PUC Terminate Gas Line Extension Allowances" as part of docket number 2545GE. The bill numbers with the link to the text is on the screen. And you're more than welcome to, when we send out the recording and the slides, to take a look at the language or just type it into your browser now if you want to read a bit more about it, but it's pretty short. And recaps a lot of what we talked about today. And I do want to highlight that today the Senate Bill S-2354 is being heard in the Senate Environment Committee later this afternoon. So if you'd like to submit testimony, you can email that to the email on the screen in writing before 3 p.m. today. So I know it's kind of a tight turnaround if you'd like to submit it in advance of the hearing so that the committee members are able to review it beforehand, or you can always reach out to your legislators afterwards. And while it's being heard in the Senate today, there is a House companion and it's been heard there already. So you can find your local legislator and send them a note on that as well if you'd like to submit for the House. And if you don't know who your legislators are, you can log into your voter registration portal, which I believe is vote.sos.ri.gov, and you can put in some of your information and it'll tell you who your local electeds are so you can get in touch with them, and it'll provide their emails on that website. The other resolution that I wanted to note was about what Amanda had discussed, those seasonal heat pump rates. That has been introduced in the Senate and has had its hearing, but you can always still submit testimony to your legislator or to the committee afterwards. That resolution is entitled "Resolution Requesting the PUC Consider the Creation and Adoption of the Seasonal Heat Pump Rate as part of the rate case docket," or Senate Resolution 2535. So these resolutions really can just serve as another push from the General Assembly to encourage the PUC to bring up these policies during the proceedings, to push on the company to really think critically about how important these are and develop them throughout this docket process. With that, back to you, Amanda.
Great. Thank you so much, both Tina and Jamie. So just a quick plug, I have to remind everyone, we are a nonprofit organization that definitely relies on donations to keep up all of our good work. So if you enjoyed this webinar or want us to be able to continue to do consumer-facing educational content as well as our advocacy efforts, please feel free to donate at greenenergyconsumers.org/give now. And with that, I think we can open it up to questions. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Well, actually, I'll give you a moment if you want to record down our email addresses in case you want to talk further about any of the things we mentioned today. And I will start pulling up the Q&A. Okay, we have one question from an attendee. Doesn't generating electricity produce emissions? How much of Rhode Island's electricity is produced in each way from solar, wind, coal, oil, etc.? So right now, first of all, New England has a regional electric grid. So when we talk about our electricity, we're talking about the entire New England region, not just Rhode Island. And about a little over 50% of our electricity comes from natural gas power plants. However, that is decreasing and renewables are increasing. So around 23% comes from nuclear energy, and then almost the remainder of that comes from renewables like solar and wind and hydro. And again, that is continuing to increase over time. Occasionally, we will still call on oil when the grid is really stressed and we need to call on some of our older and more polluting power plants. But that's a very small amount of where our electricity comes from for the most part. And I don't believe we have any more coal left in New England. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, Jamie shaking his head no. So no more coal, thankfully, which is good because that's the most polluting source of electricity. With that being said, I think you're referring to this question in terms of heat pumps. And I want to note that even with the current grid mix that we have right now, that, as I mentioned, is not 100% renewables yet, heat pumps are still far more efficient and release far more emissions than fossil fuel heating sources. So even with the grid now, you are still reducing your emissions by switching to a heat pump. And the good news is that it can only continue to get cleaner as we transition to more and more renewables fueling our electricity. Tina, I don't know if you want to jump in specifically on Rhode Island and the renewable energy standard.
Yeah, thank you. So I will talk a little bit about Rhode Island's renewable energy standard, and Jamie, feel free to jump in whenever you'd like as well. But just for a primer, in addition to the Act on Climate, so the state's legally binding climate law that was passed in 2021, in 2022, the legislature passed an update to the renewable energy standard. And so what this update did was require that by 2033, 100% of Rhode Island's electricity must be from clean sources. So that offshore wind, solar, things like that. And so each year, there's an increasing percentage of electricity supply that must come from those clean sources. So for context, in compliance year 2025, the RES was at 34%, meaning that any obligated entity or retail electricity supplier, including Rhode Island Energy, must obtain 34% of their electricity supply from clean sources. That increases to 41% in compliance year 2026. So this is really important as a supportive policy to the Act on Climate, because while we have a binding climate law, we need policies that enable the state to actually get there. So the RES is one of those foundational pieces that does that. And in the 2025 Climate Action Strategy, so that's the state's most recent climate plan, kind of giving like a progress report on what the state has done thus far to meet the Act on Climate, it modeled that the RES is like really, really foundational to meeting the Act on Climate. So that's, I find, very important to note, because this past year in early January, the governor had released his budget for fiscal year 2027. And in it is a proposal to push out the date in the renewable energy standard to 2050. So in some way, seemingly attempting to align it with the Act on Climate, but in practicality, the 100% RES by 2033 is needed to meet the interim and final mandates in the Act on Climate. It's not something that the state can just come in 2050 and like net zero emissions-ify the state, so to speak. So while that proposal was something that we, Conservation Law Foundation, and others really vehemently opposed as something just completely incongruent with the state's climate planning, with open dockets, and with, where the state is headed, there has been a bill introduced by Representative Carson and former Speaker of the House, Representative Shikarchi that keeps the renewable energy standard at 2033. Now, while that bill does do a couple of other things, the primary piece from where we sit at Green Energy Consumers is that it does keep the renewable energy standard at 2033. So ensuring that the state still has enough clean energy to meet the 20, getting on track to 2030, but also the other dates in the Act on Climate. So while, as Amanda touched on, New England and Rhode Island gets energy from the regional mix, the state has its own clean energy, additional clean energy standard layered on top of that to ensure that even with the grid mix, the state and our electricity suppliers here are still obtaining additional clean energy. Jamie, I don't know if there's anything that you'd like to elaborate on. You're muted.
Gonna get to the
There we
mute.
go.
I'm not sure if I can add anything to that pretty comprehensive view. I just think that from the premise of the question, the one thing to think about is the energy that's generated in Rhode Island is not necessarily the energy that's used in Rhode Island, and that these are two different points of comparison of what is all the energy that's generated in the region versus what did we use? And we track what we use through the RES. And so even though there might be 70% of the energy that's actually generate electricity in Rhode Island is generated from the Manchester Street Power Station, which is gas, that doesn't necessarily mean that energy that we used it because we're using and serving a regional grid. And the RES is how we track that we can be 100% renewable, even though we're still generating electricity in Rhode Island from non-renewable sources. So that's why we need to keep going with the RES. And so we're able to really displace as many of those generation facilities as possible.
Awesome. Thank you both. All right. So another question we have is, how does all of this affect households that use oil to heat their homes and hot water? So I guess to start off, the gas side of things will not have any impact on oil heated homes, but the electric side will. And I think maybe you might be asking specifically about the heat pump rate proposal. So the heat pump rate proposal would definitely increase your chances of saving if you switch to a heat pump from an oil heated home. But I want to point out that even right now with default electricity rates, 87% of homes in Rhode Island that heat with oil are already likely to save when they switch to a heat pump. And the heat pump rate proposal will increase that to 99%. So it'll definitely help increase your chance of saving, but you probably already are likely to save if you switch from an oil heated home to a heat pump heated home. So hope that answers that question. Tina and Jamie, nothing to add there? Cool. All right, let's see. What else do we have? We have one question that might be for Jamie. So it says, with the proposed profit increase, I'm wondering if a public utility is a good benchmark instead of other investor-owned utilities.
Well, I'm gonna break this into two answers. There's, do I think it, and is it, based off of our law? I would say, I mean, in a personal opinion, yes, I do think that that's a good point of comparison because it's looking at this utility versus the actual alternative, which isn't another company in another jurisdiction. That's not the comparison. The alternative is, what if we owned our own utility assets here? So I do think it's a fair comparison to have. The problem is that we have a pesky Supreme Court precedent that is roughly 100 some years old that says investor, like these type of utilities that are investor owned, have a right to a profit, and they have a right to a reasonable profit. What we don't know is there's not a standardized way of measuring what that is. So that's why all this information is coming out about what is the point of comparison. We're going to debate that point of comparison, is because the Supreme Court has said they have a right to more than 0%. So we can't set the benchmark at 0 and compare from there. I think it is more of setting a good, I don't know exactly what they're going to do. So I can't say what the point of comparison will be, but we can't do 0 because of that legal standard. And the idea would be that if you set it at 0, they wouldn't have any equity Like the investors wouldn't put their money into the utility if they were not getting anything back. And the idea behind this is that the value of having an investor-owned utility is that they can attract private money to come in. While if you're a public entity, the only way that you can raise money is through taxes or through revenue from your ratepayers. The investor-owned utility opens up private markets to pay for things. And that's supposed to be a good thing. And so if that is a good thing, you have to be able to give them a return in order for that equity to come back in. So that's the reason why it might make sense for 0% to be the benchmark and compare it to that. And logically, it's like that is the alternative to an investor-owned utility. It's just not the legal structure that we currently have in place.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. We have a question from Senator Ujifusa about a bill that I'm wondering if either Tina or Jamie is familiar with.
Yes, I'm familiar with this piece here. So I'm going to quote it so that those that are not looking at this bill, but in case you'd like, the bill that's being referenced is Senate Bill 385, and that's this year. And there's a provision of Rhode Island law that says that the Rhode Island Public Utilities Commission, in setting rates, has to recognize the need to maintain the financial health of the distribution company as a standalone entity in Rhode Island. And this gets to the question of, so what role should PPL as a parent company play in reviewing what return on equity Rhode Island Energy gets? And this is in state law, is that essentially saying that we have to treat them as an individual company, that they have to be able to maintain their profit levels and their revenues without intervention of the parent company. So that's the connection here, is like that is a requirement for them to consider. What it doesn't tell us is, how do you consider it as a standalone financial entity? Can you look at a parent company and say that is a source of capital that they have ready access to as a standalone entity, and thus it should be considered in its risk profile? Or do you say you don't consider that at all because we have to look at it as a standalone entity? I think this is a reasonable different interpretation to have, and the Public Utilities Commission will be the ones to decide, like when you consider them, when you have to make sure they can survive on their own, what role do you play when they have access to capital at the parent company level? And I appreciate Senator Ujifusa to putting in legislation to try to address this by taking it out.
Jamie, I quickly want to follow up. Does it prohibit looking at PPL? I don't know if you're familiar with the language in that level of detail, but wanted to follow up.
What do you mean by, I mean, the question here is, what do you mean by that? I mean, before I assume I know what you meant.
It was a follow-up from Senator Ujifusa, but so you're welcome to elaborate more, but just wanted to flag that. Or we can review offline and get back to you as well.
Oh, I see. I should scroll down. I think that's the question, is because the structure of PPL is in the record, in the case. So it doesn't prohibit looking at it. It's being looked at. The question is, what role does it play? When we look at it, what should we think of next? If we see that they have a whole lot of equity and low debt, what does that mean? How does that influence our view of Rhode Island Energy? If they were highly leveraged and lots of debt and low equity levels, what does that mean? We should do that. What does it mean is the question for the Public Utilities Commission, but they're not prohibited from looking at it.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. We have another question mentioning how there was a recent Volts podcast. Shout out Volts podcast if you haven't heard of it. It's a great podcast to learn about clean energy. The case was made for time of use pricing being a powerful tool to save consumers money and reduce emissions as virtual power plants. What is the incentive for the utility to implement aggressive time of use rate policies, if any?
I mean, this seems like a question for Rhode Island Energy. What is their incentive for implementing aggressive time of use policies? In absence of having them here to be able to answer it directly, I think one of the big ones is that they can avoid costs by knowing by time of use rates. And that's to say is that if you know that your system is most constrained on a August 8th afternoon around 3 p.m. when the heat is highest and the demand is most, And you can implement a time of use rate that avoids them having to do some sort of drastic intervention or risking the stability of the system in that moment by encouraging people to run their dryers, not at that time, by pricing the electricity different. That allows them to be able to deliver service at a cheaper level. There's the counter to that is like, well, wouldn't they just solve the problem of a constrained system by building something new and earn a return on equity on that? Yes, that is one path. But it's possible for us to have sufficient policies in place that say before you can do that, you have to consider alternatives like a time of use rate structure that allows us to get the same result without ratepayers having to fund an investment in capital and in infrastructure. So I think one of it is there's that piece of it. It is also responsive to the concerns that regulators keep bringing up of we can't solve all of our problems by building more poles and wires. We have to be using our grid more efficiently. Having large headroom as like large unused grid capacity at certain times and having it really constrained at other times means that we're buying things and we're not using it. We're letting it sit on the shelf for a lot of the year rather than putting it into use. And that's not a good steward of ratepayer dollars, is that if we built the thing, it's useful for 30 years, then maybe we should use it for more than 3 months out of the year. So it kind of comes to that. And I guess there's also a bit of consumers are beginning to expect this. And just like every other company, Rhode Island Energy and every utility is responsive to the expectations of its customers. That being said, I can't go get a new utility if they're not meeting my expectations. But since they're so highly regulated, I can get really angry and go to my state lawmaker and be like, hey, can you do a bunch of things to them and make my life easier because they're not listening to me? That becomes the other pressure that's out there is that if they're not responsive to customers, other pressure gets put on them. And that we're beginning to believe time of use rates is the right path. And folks that are coming in from other parts of the country are totally used to this. And so we know it needs to be implemented in that way.
I'll also note that, as consumers wait for time of use rates to be developed and rolled out, if you are in, I think the 70% of the state that already has a smart meter, so basically like below Providence, what you can do is log into your Rhode Island Energy billing portal and see your consumption data. And so while, it's kind of just like looking at your consumption data, if you are very into like the numbers and how different, like how if you turn on your washer that you might be able to draw a correlation to how it increases your energy usage, you can at the very least like look at that right now, which I find fun. You might as well. So I for what it's worth, encourage looking at your usage data. But you can also, use that as a way to say, why don't we have time of use rates? Like if people now are empowered with all of this knowledge to understand how their consumption changes throughout the day, why can't we do something productive and useful with that, such as develop structures that encourage consumers to use energy when it's most affordable or when it makes the most sense, like puts less strain on the grid, which we're kind of seeing now, like with this heat wave that we're feeling, that's putting a lot of strain on our grid, and something like a time of use rate could help kind of mitigate, usage and strain, like additional strain on the grid.
Yeah, it'll reduce the need to call on our peaker plants like oil that I was mentioning earlier, which are not only the most polluting, bad for air quality, but also the most expensive, which ends up increasing the supply side of your electricity rate as well. All right, well, with that, we have come to the full hour. So really appreciate you all sticking around for Q&A. And like I said, be on the lookout for both the recording and slides in a follow-up email soon. Thanks so much for joining.